Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell had always known that being a woman in the Navy would come with challenges, but nothing had prepared her for the humiliation she was about to face in front of the most elite warriors in the world. The Norfolk Naval Base buzzed with unusual energy that morning as word spread quickly through the corridors that something extraordinary was about to happen. Sarah had spent 3 grueling years earning her place as a naval intelligence officer. Her record was spotless, her dedication unwavering, and her expertise in maritime strategy had already saved countless lives during operations in the Persian Gulf. At 28, she commanded respect from her peers and subordinates alike. But there was one man who seemed determined to remind her that she didn't belong. Admiral Richard Hawthorne was old-school military, a man who had climbed the ranks during an era when women were barely allowed on ships, let alone in command positions. His weathered face told stories of decades at sea, and his chest displayed ribbons earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. To many, he was a hero. To Sarah, he had become her greatest obstacle. The tension between them had been building for months. It started with small comments during briefings, subtle undermining of her authority in front of junior officers, and assignments that seemed designed to set her up for failure. Sarah had endured it all with grace, knowing that responding would only give him ammunition to use against her. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when SEAL Team 6 was scheduled to receive a crucial intelligence briefing about an upcoming mission in hostile territory. These men were legends, warriors who had proven themselves in the most dangerous corners of the world. Their respect was earned, never given freely, and Sarah knew that this briefing could make or break her career. She had spent weeks preparing the intelligence package, cross-referencing satellite imagery with human intelligence reports, and building a comprehensive picture of enemy movements. The mission was critical, and lives depended on the accuracy of her work. As she walked into the briefing room, her confidence was high, despite the butterflies in her stomach. The SEALs were already seated, their faces serious and focused. These men had seen more combat than most people could imagine, and their weathered expressions reflected years of dangerous missions. Commander Jake Rodriguez, the team leader, nodded respectfully as Sarah entered. His dark eyes held the kind of intensity that came from leading men into impossible situations and bringing them home alive. Behind him sat 8 other operators, each one a master of his craft. There was Thompson, the sniper whose steady hands had eliminated threats from over a mile away. Martinez, the explosives expert who could disarm a bomb with his eyes closed. Johnson, the medic who had saved more lives under fire than any field hospital. Each man represented the pinnacle of military excellence. Sarah took her position at the front of the room, her laptop connected to the large screen display. She had just begun her opening remarks when the door burst open with more force than necessary. Admiral Hawthorne strode into the room, his presence immediately commanding attention from everyone present. "Gentlemen," he announced loudly, his voice carrying the authority of decades in command. "I apologize for interrupting, but I felt it necessary to personally oversee this briefing." His eyes swept the room before settling on Sarah with unmistakable disdain. "We cannot afford any mistakes when it comes to the safety of our finest warriors." The implication hung heavy in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Sarah felt her cheeks flush, but she maintained her composure. The SEALs shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their professional demeanor masking whatever thoughts were running through their minds. "Thank you for joining us, Admiral," Sarah replied evenly, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "I was just beginning to outline the intelligence parameters for Operation Neptune's Trident." Hawthorne moved to the back of the room, his arms crossed over his chest in a posture that screamed disapproval. "Please continue," he said, his tone dripping with the kind of condescension that could cut through steel. "Let's see what kind of intelligence our diversity hires can provide to real warriors." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. but she had learned long ago not to show weakness in front of men who might interpret it as confirmation of their prejudices. She clicked to the first slide, a detailed satellite image of the target compound, and began her presentation with professional precision. The target facility is located approximately 40 kilometers inland from the coast, she began, using a laser pointer to highlight key features on the image. Intelligence indicates that high-value targets are being held in the eastern wing of the compound, here. She moved the red dot to a specific building within the complex. As Sarah continued her briefing, Admiral Hawthorne made a show of checking his watch, sighing audibly and shaking his head at various points. His behavior was designed to undermine her credibility, and Sarah could feel the attention of the room shifting between her presentation and the Admiral's theatrical disapproval. The enemy force strength is estimated at between 30 and 40 combatants, Sarah continued, her voice never wavering despite the distraction. However, our human intelligence sources indicate that this number may be conservative. I recommend planning for up to 60 hostile contacts. Excuse me? Admiral Hawthorne interrupted, his voice cutting through Sarah's explanation like a knife through silk. Did you say 60 contacts? Based on what evidence? He stepped forward, his intimidating presence filling the space between Sarah and the SEALs. Sarah turned to face him directly, her spine straight and her chin raised. Based on analysis of communication intercepts, movement patterns observed through drone surveillance, and reports from assets on the ground, Admiral. Hawthorne laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It was the kind of laugh that preceded destruction, the kind that generals used before ordering artillery strikes on enemy positions. Assets on the ground, he repeated mockingly. You mean the same assets that told us there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? The same intelligence community that has been wrong about enemy strength consistently for the past 2 decades? The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning system. Sarah could feel the eyes of every SEAL in the room watching this exchange, measuring both her response and the Admiral's behavior. These men had lived through the consequences of bad intelligence, had lost brothers because someone behind a desk had made a mistake with numbers on a screen. Admiral, Sarah replied carefully, intelligence is never 100% certain. That's why I always recommend planning for worst-case scenarios. It's better to be over-prepared than to send these men into a situation where they're outnumbered and outgunned. Hawthorne's face darkened like a storm cloud gathering strength. Don't lecture me about sending men into combat, Lieutenant. I was leading missions when you were still in diapers. He turned to address the SEALs directly, dismissing Sarah as if she had become invisible. Gentlemen, this is exactly why combat operations should be left to those who understand the realities of warfare, not desk jockeys who think they can understand battle from satellite images and computer screens. The insult was designed to destroy her credibility completely. In a room full of elite warriors, being labeled as someone who didn't understand combat was professional death. Sarah felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack under the weight of public humiliation. But before she could respond, something unexpected happened. Commander Rodriguez stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor in the sudden silence. His dark eyes were fixed on Admiral Hawthorne, and his expression had shifted from professional neutrality to something much more dangerous. Admiral, Rodriguez said, his voice quiet, but carrying the kind of authority that comes from leading men through hell and back. With all due respect, sir, Lieutenant Mitchell's intelligence briefings have been instrumental in the success of our last 6 operations. Her analysis saved my team from walking into an ambush in Syria last month. The other SEALs began to shift in their seats, and Sarah could sense a change in the atmosphere of the room. These men had worked with her before, had trusted their lives to her intelligence, and had come home because of her meticulous preparation. Admiral Hawthorne's face reddened as he realized that his attempt to humiliate Sarah was backfiring spectacularly. "Commander Rodriguez, I'm sure you appreciate the lieutenant's efforts, but surely you understand the importance of having experienced leadership overseeing critical intelligence operations." It was then that Thompson, the sniper, stood up as well. His movements were fluid and precise, like everything else about him. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying the slight drawl of his Texas origins, "Lieutenant Mitchell spotted movement patterns that our own reconnaissance missed. Because of her warning, we were able to adjust our approach and complete the mission without casualties." One by one, the other SEALs began to stand. Martinez rose next, followed by Johnson, then the rest of the team. Each man stood at attention, their eyes focused not on Admiral Hawthorne, but on Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell. It was a gesture of respect that spoke louder than any words could have. The silence stretched between heartbeats as Admiral Hawthorne found himself facing 9 of the most elite warriors in the world, all standing in support of the woman he had just attempted to destroy. His face cycled through emotions like a traffic light malfunctioning, confusion, anger, and finally a dawning realization that he had made a serious tactical error. Sarah felt tears threatening to break free, but she held them back through sheer force of will. These men, these legends, were putting their own careers on the line to defend her honor. In the rigid hierarchy of the military, what they were doing bordered on insubordination, but they were doing it anyway because they believed in her. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a blade, and everyone present knew that what happened next would determine the course of several careers and possibly change the dynamics of respect and recognition within the entire naval command structure. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of aircraft taking off from the naval air station. Admiral Hawthorne stood frozen, his face a mask of barely controlled rage as he processed the unprecedented display of solidarity before him. Never in his 30 years of military service had he witnessed anything like this. 9 elite operators standing in unified defiance of his authority. Commander Rodriguez took a step forward, his boots clicking against the polished floor with military precision. His voice, when he spoke, was measured and respectful, but carried an undertone of steel that every person in the room could hear. "Admiral Hawthorne, sir, with your permission, I'd like to share something with you about Lieutenant Mitchell's performance during Operation Desert Storm." Sarah's heart pounded as she watched Rodriguez address the Admiral directly. She knew the commander was risking his career, potentially throwing away 20 years of exemplary service to defend her honor. The weight of that sacrifice was almost overwhelming. "During our insertion into Syria last month," Rodriguez continued, his eyes never leaving the Admiral's face, "Lieutenant Mitchell identified heat signatures in satellite imagery that our own intelligence analysts had missed. She noticed patterns in guard rotations that seemed random but actually indicated a much larger force presence than originally estimated." Thompson stepped forward to join his commander, his lean frame casting a long shadow across the briefing room floor. "Sir, because of her analysis, we knew to expect twice the resistance we had planned for. We went in with additional firepower and backup plans that saved all our lives." The Admiral's jaw tightened, but he remained silent as Martinez added his voice to the growing testimony. "Lieutenant Mitchell doesn't just read reports and pass them along," the explosives expert said, his accent thick with emotion. "She studies enemy tactics, learns their patterns, and thinks like they think. That's why her intelligence is different from what we usually get." Johnson, the team medic, nodded in agreement. "She once spent 3 days straight analyzing communication intercepts to figure out when enemy forces changed shifts. That information allowed us to extract a captured pilot without firing a single shot. No American casualties, no international incident, mission accomplished." Admiral Hawthorne's face was growing redder by the moment, but he seemed trapped, by the flood of testimony from men whose opinions carried enormous weight throughout the military community. These weren't junior enlisted personnel or fresh-faced lieutenants. These were seasoned warriors with decades of combined combat experience. Furthermore, Rodriguez continued, his voice gaining strength as he sensed support from his team, Lieutenant Mitchell has personally requested to join us on operations. She's not content to sit behind a desk while we carry out missions based on her intelligence. She wants to see the results firsthand to understand how her work translates into real-world conditions. This revelation caused Admiral Hawthorne to take a step backward, his composure finally beginning to crack. The idea of a female intelligence officer requesting combat duty clearly challenged every assumption he had made about Sarah's character and commitment. "That's impossible," the Admiral sputtered, his voice rising for the first time since the confrontation began. "Intelligence officers don't participate in direct action missions. It's against protocol, against regulations, against everything we've established for operational security." Sarah felt a surge of courage flow through her as she watched these incredible men defend not just her work, but her dedication to the mission. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "Admiral, with respect, I've completed the same physical fitness requirements as any other officer. I've trained in combat scenarios, I'm qualified on multiple weapon systems, and I understand the risks involved." The Admiral turned his attention back to Sarah, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Lieutenant, you have no idea what you're talking about. Combat is not a training exercise or a simulation. It's life and death, split-second decisions that determine who goes home and who doesn't." "Sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt inside, "I understand that better than you think. Every piece of intelligence I provide, every analysis I complete, could mean the difference between these men coming home safely or not coming home at all. That weight keeps me awake at night, drives me to double-check every detail, to question every assumption." Rodriguez nodded approvingly at Sarah's words before addressing the Admiral again. "Sir, Lieutenant Mitchell has already proven her worth under pressure. During the extraction mission in Somalia 2 months ago, she was monitoring communications in real time from the command center. When enemy forces began moving to cut off our exit route, she identified the threat and coordinated with air support to create a diversion that allowed us to escape." The testimonies kept coming, each one building on the last, creating an overwhelming picture of competence, dedication, and courage that stood in stark contrast to Admiral Hawthorne's assumptions about Sarah's abilities. Thompson shared how her weather analysis had helped them avoid a sandstorm that would have compromised their position. Martinez described how her study of local customs had prevented a diplomatic disaster during a sensitive extraction. As the SEALs continued to speak, other personnel began gathering outside the briefing room. Word was spreading quickly through the base that something unprecedented was happening, that the most elite unit in the Navy was taking a stand on behalf of a female intelligence officer. Through the glass windows, Sarah could see faces pressed against the glass, trying to understand what was causing such a commotion. Admiral Hawthorne seemed to realize that his position was becoming increasingly untenable. The men standing before him represented the pinnacle of military excellence, warriors whose opinions carried weight throughout the entire chain of command. Their unified support for Lieutenant Mitchell was not something that could be easily dismissed or ignored. "Gentlemen," the Admiral said, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining authority in an impossible situation, "I appreciate your loyalty to your intelligence officer, but this display is highly inappropriate. Military discipline requires respect for rank and chain of command." Commander Rodriguez's response was immediate and devastating in its simplicity. "Sir, military discipline also requires respect for competence, courage, and dedication to the mission. Lieutenant Mitchell has demonstrated all 3 qualities consistently and professionally. The room fell silent again as the full weight of Rodriguez's words sank in. He had essentially accused the Admiral of failing to recognize the very qualities that the military claimed to value most. It was a masterful verbal maneuver that put Hawthorne in an impossible position. Sarah watched the Admiral's face as he processed the implications of what had just happened. His attempt to humiliate her had backfired spectacularly, turning into a public demonstration of support that would be talked about throughout the naval community for years to come. The story would spread through unofficial channels, whispered in mess halls and shared during off-duty conversations. The Admiral's next words would determine not just the immediate outcome of this confrontation, but potentially the future of gender integration within special operations communities. Sarah could see him calculating, weighing his options, trying to find a way to salvage his authority while acknowledging the reality of what these elite warriors were telling him. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Admiral Hawthorne said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "please continue with your briefing. I'm interested to hear the rest of your intelligence assessment." It was not an apology, not an admission of error, but it was a concession. The Admiral was stepping back from his direct attack on Sarah's credibility, allowing her to complete her presentation without further interference. For now, that was enough. Rodriguez and his team remained standing as Sarah returned to her position at the front of the room. Their continued presence sent a clear message that they would not tolerate any further attempts to undermine her authority or expertise. The protective stance of these legendary warriors created a shield around Sarah that was stronger than any armor. As Sarah prepared to resume her briefing, she felt a profound shift in the dynamics of the room. The respect she had earned through months of meticulous work and professional excellence was now publicly acknowledged by the most elite warriors in the world. Their support had transformed a moment of potential humiliation into a powerful demonstration of military values at their finest. The intelligence briefing that followed would be one of the most thorough and professional presentations of Sarah's career, delivered with the confidence that comes from knowing that competence and dedication will ultimately triumph over prejudice and narrow-mindedness. Sarah completed her intelligence briefing with newfound confidence, her voice strong and clear as she detailed every aspect of the upcoming mission. The SEALs remained standing throughout the entire presentation, their silent support creating an atmosphere of professional respect that had been missing from the beginning of the meeting. Admiral Hawthorne said nothing more, his face a careful mask of controlled neutrality as he listened to intelligence that even he had to admit was thorough and professional. When Sarah finished her final slide, Commander Rodriguez stepped forward once again. His next words would echo through the corridors of military history, spoken with the quiet authority of a man who had earned the right to challenge anyone, regardless of rank. "Admiral," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying across the now silent room, "I have a request, sir. My team and I would like Lieutenant Mitchell to be assigned as our primary intelligence liaison for all future operations. We trust her analysis, we value her expertise, and we want her working directly with us on mission planning." The request was unprecedented. Special operations teams rarely made such specific personnel requests, and they certainly didn't make them in front of senior officers during what had already become a highly charged confrontation. Rodriguez was essentially forcing Admiral Hawthorne to make a public decision about Sarah's competence and value to the team. Sarah felt her heart racing as she realized the full implications of what Rodriguez was proposing. Assignment as a direct liaison to SEAL Team 6 would be a career-defining opportunity, the kind of position that could establish her as one of the Navy's premier intelligence officers. It would also mean working directly with these extraordinary men on the most dangerous and important missions in the world. Admiral Hawthorne's face went through another series of expressions as he processed this unexpected development. He clearly had not anticipated that his attempt to humiliate Sarah would result in such a strong endorsement from the very men whose respect he had been trying to protect. The tables had turned completely, and now he found himself in the position of having to respond to a reasonable military request that he could not easily refuse. "Commander Rodriguez," the Admiral said slowly, his words carefully chosen. "Assignment decisions are made through proper channels, based on operational needs and personnel availability. I'm sure Lieutenant Mitchell appreciates your confidence in her abilities." It was a diplomatic non-answer, the kind of bureaucratic language that military officers used when they needed time to think or when they were trying to avoid making commitments they might later regret. But Rodriguez was not finished with his demonstration of support for Sarah. "Sir," the commander continued, "I'm prepared to put this request in writing with the full endorsement of my entire team. We believe that Lieutenant Mitchell's intelligence work is crucial to mission success and the safety of our personnel." Thompson stepped forward to join his commander, his voice adding weight to the formal request. "Admiral, in my 15 years as a SEAL, I've worked with dozens of intelligence officers. Lieutenant Mitchell is the best I've ever encountered. Her attention to detail and understanding of enemy tactics have saved lives on multiple occasions." Martinez nodded in agreement, his weathered hands clasped behind his back in a position of military attention. "Sir, we're not making this request lightly. We've discussed it as a team, and we're unanimous in our assessment of Lieutenant Mitchell's value to our operations." The Admiral found himself facing a dilemma that would have challenged even the most experienced military politician. 9 elite warriors were making a formal request for a specific intelligence officer, publicly endorsing her competence and value in front of witnesses. Refusing the request would require him to provide justification for why he believed their assessment was wrong, essentially calling into question the judgment of his most elite operators. Sarah watched this extraordinary drama unfold, still hardly believing that these legendary warriors were willing to stake their own reputations on supporting her career. She had worked hard to earn their respect through performance and professionalism, but seeing that respect translated into such a powerful public demonstration was overwhelming. The Admiral seemed to realize that he had lost control of the situation completely. What had begun as an attempt to establish his authority and put a junior officer in her place had become a public endorsement of that officer by the most respected warriors in the Navy. Every minute that passed without a decision was making his position weaker and more untenable. "Gentlemen," Admiral Hawthorne said finally, his voice carrying a note of resignation that hadn't been there before, "I will take your request under consideration. Lieutenant Mitchell's performance record speaks for itself, and if you believe she would be an asset to your operations, then we should certainly explore that possibility." It was not the full approval that Rodriguez had requested, but it was a significant retreat from the Admiral's earlier position. He was acknowledging Sarah's competence and agreeing to consider the team's request, which represented a complete reversal from his attempt to undermine her credibility. Commander Rodriguez sensed that this was the moment for the gesture that would define this entire confrontation. He turned to face Sarah directly, his dark eyes meeting hers across the briefing room. Then, with deliberate precision, he brought his right hand up in the sharpest, most respectful military salute Sarah had ever received. The salute was not just a gesture of military courtesy, it was a public acknowledgement of Sarah's professionalism, competence, and value as a fellow warrior. Coming from a man of Rodriguez's stature and reputation, it carried enormous symbolic weight throughout the military community. One by one, the other SEALs followed their commander's example. Thompson snapped to attention and rendered a crisp salute, his face serious and respectful. Martinez did the same, his movements precise and deliberate. Johnson, the medic who had seen more combat than most infantry officers, raised his hand to his forehead in a gesture of genuine respect. Soon, all 9 members of SEAL Team 6 were standing at attention, rendering simultaneous salutes to Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell in front of Admiral Hawthorne and the growing crowd of onlookers who had gathered outside the briefing room. It was a moment of pure military theater, a demonstration of respect and solidarity that transcended rank and hierarchy. Sarah felt tears threatening to overflow as she returned the salute, her own hand trembling slightly with emotion as she acknowledged the incredible honor these men were showing her. The moment seemed to stretch on forever, crystallized in time like a photograph that would be remembered long after the participants had moved on to other assignments and other challenges. Admiral Hawthorne stood frozen, his face a mixture of shock and grudging recognition as he watched his elite warriors demonstrate their respect for the woman he had tried to humiliate. The message was clear and unmistakable. Competence and dedication would always triumph over prejudice and narrow thinking in the warrior culture of the Navy's most elite units. When the salutes were finally lowered, Commander Rodriguez addressed the room one final time. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said formally, "SEAL Team 6 looks forward to working with you on future operations. Your intelligence and professionalism are exactly what we need to accomplish our missions and bring our people home safely." The words were spoken loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, including Admiral Hawthorne. It was a public commitment that would be difficult to reverse or ignore, a statement that established Sarah's position within the special operations community, regardless of what bureaucratic obstacles might be placed in her path. As the meeting began to break up, personnel outside the briefing room started to disperse, carrying with them the story of what had just transpired. Word would spread quickly through the base and beyond, reaching other commands and other services through the informal networks that connected military professionals around the world. Admiral Hawthorne gathered his materials and headed for the door, his departure marking the end of one of the most remarkable confrontations in recent military history. He had entered the room expecting to demonstrate his authority and put a junior officer in her place. Instead, he had witnessed a master class in military professionalism and the true meaning of respect within the warrior culture. Sarah remained behind as the SEALs filed out, each man nodding respectfully as they passed her position at the front of the room. Commander Rodriguez was the last to leave, pausing at the door to offer one final comment. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom, "you've got what it takes to succeed in this business. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As the door closed behind him, Sarah found herself alone in the briefing room, surrounded by the echoes of an extraordinary demonstration of military respect and solidarity. She had entered the room as a competent intelligence officer, facing an unfair challenge to her authority. She was leaving as a warrior whose competence had been publicly endorsed by the most elite fighters in the world. The sharp salute rendered by SEAL Team 6 would become legendary within naval intelligence circles, a symbol of how merit and professionalism could overcome prejudice and establish new standards for inclusion and respect. It was a moment that would define not just Sarah's career, but the careers of countless other military professionals who would follow in her footsteps. The mission that had brought them all together that day would be executed flawlessly 3 weeks later, with Sarah's intelligence proving crucial to its success. But the real victory had already been won in that briefing room, where 9 elite warriors had chosen to stand up for what they believed was right, regardless of the personal cost to their own careers. Years later, when Sarah had risen to become one of the Navy's most respected intelligence officers, she would still remember that moment when SEAL Team 6 rendered their sharp salute in front of Admiral Hawthorne. It was the day she learned that true respect in the military is never given based on rank or position alone, but earned through competence, dedication, and the courage to stand up for what is right.